This colleague has contacted many of them, and they never have any record. And when she contacts them, she typically will ask them about 10 different viruses. So measles, HIV, HPV, influenza, Ebola, Zika. She asks them about a whole bunch, and they don't have anything for any of these viruses. And then people can just scroll down the page. There was adenovirus. Most of these where we have entries, I have asked the CDC because they're so influential around the world. You know, a lot of people just think that the CDC must know what they're talking about. So that's usually who I ask when it comes to other viruses, but other people, they've asked other institutions as well. And it just doesn't matter. This is the European CDC, their version, and that was for the H5N1 avian influenza virus. They didn't have anything. And it just goes on and on and on. There's Ebola virus. Nobody had that. Epstein-Barr, hepatitis. We only have one for that. Herpes, HIV. It goes on and on and on. So yeah, hopefully this helps people to realize that there's just nothing. Doesn't matter which one we ask about. So again, these are all publicly. There's one from Japan, National Institute of Infectious Diseases. That was for influenza virus. They have nothing. So yeah, hopefully this helps people to see what's really going on there in virology. It's not what we were led to believe all our lives.
Hi everyone, my name is Kate and I'm honored to have Christine Massey with me here today. Christine comes from Canada. She has a background in biostatistics. She used to work in cancer research. Since the COVID-19 started, she began to investigate the subject of virology and showed to thousands of people how pseudoscientific it actually is, using a very interesting approach that no one else has ever done. Christine started to send freedom of information requests to the major health organizations in various countries, such as American CDC, Public Health Agency of Canada, Australian Department of Health, Brazilian Ministry of Health, Public Health England, and so on, asking them for proof of isolation and purification of many different viruses, including SARS-CoV-2, HIV, measles, Ebola, and others. She inspired a lot of other people to send their own freedom of information requests to the authorities and public health policymakers in their countries. Because of these hundreds of freedom of information requests around the world were sent to these institutions. And in their replies, all of them failed to provide any proofs of the existence of any virus they were asked about. This is obviously not something you would expect from the institutions that claim that there is a pandemic and it is caused by virus and people need to get vaccinated. It is logical to assume that they must be equipped with all the necessary scientific proofs, which they can easily provide to anyone who asks for it. Anyone who will look at Christine's work will see that they don't have any proofs, only unfounded claims. And this is what we are going to talk about today. So Christian, thank you so much for being here with me. My first question to you is, could you please tell us your story? How did it happen so that you started to investigate the topic of virology? And how did you start to notice that there is something wrong with it?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me, Kate. I'm really honored. I really admire all the work that you're doing. So yeah, what happened was before, I call it fake COVID, before fake COVID started, I had already been interacting with the public health community because I was opposing water fluoridation, which is another supposedly a great public health achievement, but there's actually a lot of issues with it. So for 10 years before fake COVID, I had already seen that the public health community can't be relied on for accurate information, and I'd had really bad experiences with them. So I wasn't trusting them when they started talking about this virus. Nothing was making sense to me. And then I was learning about the PCR tests because I knew they were not legitimate. And then there were a couple of things. I came across a document by David Crow in Canada, who had, by April of 2020, he had already pulled apart the whole narrative from various different angles. And then I came across presentations by Dr. Andrew Kaufman, and he explained really clearly in his presentation how virologists could find and purify a virus if it actually existed, and what they actually do in their studies. And he made it really clear that anybody could understand that what they were doing didn't make any sense. So that was what got me started. That was what inspired the first Freedom of Information request that I did.
Thank you. So before we talk about the Freedom of Information requests, let's talk about the main problems of virology and the lack of the scientific method.
Sure. So what I learned from Dr. Kaufman was how incredibly unscientific virology actually is. And it's so great that you keep talking about this and people around the world are learning, because it's actually a simple topic, pretty simple topic to learn about. And if people understood, they would never be in fear of viruses again, because they would realize there was never any evidence for them in the first place. And it really, 2020 should have just been another normal year. There wasn't anything new to talk about. So it should have just been life as normal. And so I have focused a lot on the fact that virologists don't find a particle in bodily fluids and then purify it out. Because the way I look at it, if you were scientific and you wanted to do things in a careful, logical way, and you think there's a new particle, your first step would be to go looking where you think it is and see if you can find it. And then, of course, you'd want to take away all the other stuff, because if you take a sample from the nose, the snot, or the lung fluid, there's going to be all kinds of stuff in there. So you need to remove everything else and just get that one thing by itself. And then you can study that one thing and do controlled experiments and find out, does it actually fit the definition of a virus? But in virology, they don't come anywhere close to doing that. They are always working with circular reasoning, making crazy assumptions, doing procedures that don't involve any logic. And a big part of it has been the cell culture over the years, where they actually mix the patient sample, just the patient sample that they usually don't even bother filtering. They put that with a cell line, and then they add the cow material. They add fetal bovine serum from a cow to feed the cell line. And the cell line is usually monkey kidney cells, which is really strange for a virus that supposedly, infects humans. And their rationale for doing that is that they say, well, if we looked in the bodily fluids from the human who is sick, who we think has a viral infection, we wouldn't be able to find the virus. And so instead we have to give it a chance to grow in a cell line, in a lab dish. And it doesn't make any sense, because if a person was really sick because of a virus, there should be many, many copies. There should be all kinds of it, and it should be very easy to find. So it doesn't make any sense when they say we have to grow it in a dish in order to find it, but that's what they say. And then typically they don't even use human lung cells, which, at least that would be the logical cell line that you would think they would use, but usually they don't. Instead, they use monkey kidney cells. And in the occasions where they have used human cells, they're using lung cancer cells. So they're not even using healthy cells. And So, and then they add the material from the cow, and this is making things incredibly complex. So, and then they add the toxic drugs because they say they don't want bacteria and fungi to grow in their mixture. So they add those. But now we're in a situation where you've made a very complex mixture. You're now adding toxic substances that are harmful to the cells. And they also lower the amount of the fetal bovine serum because they start out with an amount that would be able to maintain the cell line, keep it healthy, because it's food for the cells, but then they lower it. So now they're starving and poison the cell line. And then, as you know, they watch the cells for a few days. And then when the cells start to break down, they say, oh, there's a virus, we isolated the virus. And it's ridiculous. They haven't isolated anything. They haven't shown that a virus caused anything because they didn't do a controlled experiment with a specific particle. If they had done that, that would be completely different because, if you do a careful controlled experiment and you have everything the same in the experimental group and the control group, then you could attribute causation to that one thing that only goes to the experimental group. But that's not what they're doing. They don't have a proper independent variable, and they can't even do a proper controlled experiment because they haven't bothered to purify out the particle that they think might be a virus. So it's just completely illogical. And, their reasoning is, well, if there is a virus, it will cause the cells to break down. And oh, look, the cells broke down, so it must be a virus that did it. But it doesn't make sense, right? Because we know maybe it's because you're lowered the nutrition for the cells, and the drugs that you added contributed, and who knows what actually caused it to happen. So it's just circular reasoning. And like some of my colleagues have said, you could say, well, if Santa Claus comes to the house on Christmas Eve, we'll find presents under the tree. Oh, there's presents under the tree. That proves that Santa Claus came to the house. But we know that that's not a proof. So,
Thank
yeah.
you. Yes. So they're just pointing at how to call it indirect evidence, but you cannot even call it indirect evidence because to be able to call something an indirect evidence, you have to show how it is tied, related to the actual thing. So, and then you can say that something is an indirect evidence. So I don't really like to call it this way, but they are just showing us this effect that they have in their petri dishes after all these incredible manipulations, and say that there is a proof for a virus. So my question is, if because a lot of people who will watch this, they will be completely new to this. So if how would you describe the steps that they should do to follow the scientific method? So if they really wanted to follow the scientific method, the virologists, what would they do?
They should find this particle in the bodily fluids from a sick person, and they should purify it out, which, and they have technologies where they can purify very tiny things. So it's not that they don't have the technology. So they can use ultracentrifugation, for example. So get that thing by itself and then do controlled experiments. And another problem with their cell cultures is that what they're doing in the cell culture is completely unnatural. So it couldn't tell you anything about what's actually going on in a human body anyway. They have a dish in a laboratory, and they've added something from the human, something from a cow, monkey cells, and drugs. Like, it has no bearing on what's actually going on in nature. So what you would want to do is, you'd want to sequence and characterize this particle because you want to identify it, and make sure you're not getting confused with something that was already identified. You want to know what it is that you're studying. And you would need to do controlled experiments. So if you want to show that this particle causes disease, then I'm not advocating for animal experiments, but what they do is animal experiments. It's considered unethical to do these kind of experiments on humans. So they use animals and they do animal experiments, but what they should do is expose the animals to this particle in a way that's natural. And of course, you have to have a controlled experiment. So you'd want to have other animals that you treat in the exact same way. And the only difference should be that the experimental group gets exposed to this particle and the control group doesn't. And then if the animals in the experimental group get sick and the other animals don't, then you have evidence that that particle caused the disease. And it should be the disease that, you know, that you were interested in the first place. So with COVID, you would be looking for COVID symptoms. But what they do in virology instead is, number one, like we said, they never purify a particle. So when they do their experiments, they're using either just the clinical sample that they took from the patient, or they might even use some of that cell culture mixture that they created. But then the other major problem with their experiments is they always expose the animals in a completely unnatural way. And typically it involves injections. And there's been some studies where they inject them in the head or the heart or the abdominal cavity. And again, this has nothing to do with what actually goes on in nature. So, they had this hypothesis that there's a particle that's causing disease naturally, that animal or the hosts are spreading it to each other just by breathing and talking or touching things, and it just spreads naturally. But they don't do the experiments that way. They're injecting them, which has nothing to do with their hypothesis. So it's not a valid experiment. It's not a valid way to investigate what they're looking at. But this is what they do. This is what they get away with. So they'll do these type of experiments, and either they don't even get the symptoms that they were looking for, but they just gloss over that, or they get some symptoms, but maybe it's unrelated symptoms, like ruffled fur, which has nothing to do with COVID, or the animals just don't get sick, or and if they do get sick, you can't attribute it to any specific particle, and you certainly can't attribute it to a specific little particle that supposedly gets spread around naturally. So it's just everything that you look at in virology, whether it's the cell cultures or their animal experiments or their fake genomes, everything they do is invalid. It's never even logical. And this is why it's pretty easy for people to understand. If you try to read a virology paper on your own for the first time and you're not used to all the terminology, that can be intimidating for sure. But the basic concepts are very simple for people to understand. And I think even, like a young person, a teenager or a 12-year-old could look at this and say that doesn't make any sense. And yet this is what they've been doing for decades and decades. So I hope I answered your question. I kind of rambled on there for a while.
It's perfect. Thank you so much. Actually, I managed to explain this to 8-year-old kids. So it's extremely simple. No excuse to not to understand this, in my opinion. So thank you. So my next question is, why did you decide to send this Freedom of Information requests? And let's explain to people what is the Freedom of Information Act.
Sure. So in most countries, there's legislation. It might be called the Access to Information Act, or in Ontario, where I live in Canada, we have the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. You're looking for something like that. But a lot of countries have legislation that allows people to ask for records that the government has that are not already publicly available. So usually, if a record is already publicly available, the legislation doesn't apply to that. It'll apply to things that are not already accessible to the public. And so basically, it's there's an advantage to doing a Freedom of Information request over just sending a casual email, because you can just send a casual email or a letter as well, right? But the thing is, they're not necessarily going to answer you. But with Freedom of Information legislation, they have an actual protocol that they have to follow, and typically they have to respond within a certain number of days. So in Canada, it's 30 days, but some places it's as short as 5 days. They have to get back to you. So they're supposed to get back to you and let you either give you access to the records that you asked for or give you a reason why they're not going to give you access. And so that's basically freedom of information. Anybody can file it. Sometimes there's fees involved just even for making the application, but not always. And yeah, so it's just a formal process for getting access to records. And I forget what the other part of your question was, sorry.
Yeah, I asked, why did you decide to send them to these institutions?
Right. So when I learned from Dr. Andrew Kaufman that the virologists had not done things properly in China, he was also reviewing, I think he reviewed a Canadian study and one other study, I forget, but there were 4 studies in particular that he looked at. And he was explaining, and I saw what he was saying, understood. I looked at the studies for myself and I confirmed what he was saying. I looked at other studies as well, and they were all basically doing these nonsense methodologies. So I thought, well, I can use freedom of information because I had done that in the past on other topics. So I already knew about doing freedom of information requests. So I thought, I'm going to ask Health Canada, and that way, if there really is a valid study, maybe we just don't know about it, we haven't found it. I wanted to make sure. I wanted to double check. So I thought I'll ask Health Canada. And that way, if we miss something and there really is a proper study somewhere, they should have it and they will give it to me and then we'll know. And if there's not a proper study, then I will have evidence that will help people understand that what Dr. Kaufman is telling people is true. Like, look, I asked Health Canada and they don't have anything. And that's exactly what happened. So I was focusing initially on Canadian institutions because that's where I am. And none of the institutions that I asked had any records. So yeah, it was a way to get evidence to help people see that what people like you and Dr. Kaufman and Tom Cowan and others are telling people is correct.
Thank you so much. So my next question is, what do you ask and how do you board them? Because this is important. Maybe you could show us an example and maybe a couple of cases if it is possible.
For sure. Yeah, so I'll share my screen and I'll show you an example. So here's one from, let me see, this is from August of 2021. So this one went to the CDC in the United States. That's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And it's pretty long, but I'll skip over the less important words, but people can find lots of examples on my website. But what I said was I'm looking for all studies or reports in the possession, custody, or control of the CDC that describe the purification of any COVID-19 virus, including any of the alleged variants. And I said, for example, using filtration, ultracentrifugation, and chromotomography. Those are just some of the possible technologies that could have been used. And it said directly from a sample taken from a diseased human, where the patient sample was not first combined with any other source of genetic material. So, and I said that because I want to weed out these bogus studies where they use the cell cultures. The first thing they do in those studies is they put the clinical sample in with the cell line and contaminated their patient sample. So I'm trying to just weed those out. And then the next paragraph, I'm trying to be really, really clear what it is that I'm asking for and what I'm not asking for, because I don't want them to waste my time sending me studies that are not what I'm asking for. So I say, I'm not asking for records where the researchers failed to purify the suspected virus and instead did cell culturing, or they did a PCR test, or they made up a genome, or they made electron microscopy images of unpurified things. So I'm just being super, super clear about what I'm asking for, what I'm not asking for. And then I said to them, I'm already aware that according to virus theory, a virus requires host cells in order to replicate. I'm not asking for records that describe replication of a virus without host cells. And the reason I sometimes say that part is, sometimes we have people saying, well, what you're asking for is impossible because a virus needs host cells to replicate. But I'm not asking for records of a virus replicating without host cells. So I'm just trying to be really super clear so that to eliminate the silly responses. And I also said, I'm not requesting records that describe a suspected virus floating in a vacuum, because we had one institution say, they made it sound like that's what we were asking for. I'm only asking for records that describe purification, meaning separation from everything else, as per standard laboratory practices for the purification of other very small things. So I'm not asking for anything out of the ordinary, just, however these things are normally done, that's what I'm looking for. And I always say in my request that the request is not limited to records that were authored by that institution. I'm asking for any record that they have written by anybody in the world. You would think that the CDC would have made sure that this alleged virus and all these other alleged viruses actually exist. So you would think that they would have studies downloaded, for example, from China. And so I'm just being super clear, like any record at all written by anybody. And that's basically, and then I also always say that this part's really tiny, you can't quite see it, but I'm saying if there's any records that match my description of what I'm looking for, and they're already publicly available, then please cite them for me. Give me the title, the author, let me know where I can find it, because again, freedom of information only applies to records that are not already publicly available. So what they'll sometimes try to do, they might try to say, oh, there are studies like that, but they're already publicly available, so we don't have to help you, right? So that's why I'm saying, if they are already publicly available, let me know. Let me know exactly what you're talking about so I can go and find it. So I'm trying to just make the request as cover all the different possible situations that could occur, so that they don't have people don't say, oh, well, it's already publicly available. It's in the journals, right? If it is, okay, fine. Tell me where, tell me where so I can find it, and they don't have it. So that was one specific request from August of 2021. And I know it's very long and complicated, but that's how I do it, just to try to be really careful. And there's also a template on my website that people can find if they ever want to send their own request. There's an example there that has the wording as well. And I'll show you the response that we got to this request. I don't remember offhand exactly what they said that time. Oh, they gave us a link to a study. So this is what happens a lot in the responses. Sometimes they just admit that they don't have any records. And then sometimes they'll refer us to a study or a website. And the problem is every time we look at these studies, they're not what we were asking for. So this study that they referred us to there, that one is probably the study by Jennifer Harcourt and al., which is a CDC study. And that one, we have looked at that one since 2020. Of course, I'm sure you've seen it as well. And it's just the cell culturing, and, they made up a genome. And yeah, so this is what we typically did. This is the responses that we typically get. I could show you another response from the CDC if you like.
Yeah.
This is our very first request that went to the CDC, and I'll just mention too, this one was done by my colleague Michael S. in New Zealand, because a lot of other people around the world have helped with this project. It wasn't me that did them all. So I guess I have to move that aside. So this was the very first one, November 2nd. It's from the CDC. And they said a search of our records failed to reveal any documents pertaining to your request. So that was their very first response. And then we have 7 more responses from the CDC that, because people have asked many times, and ever since then they always make up they don't give a straightforward response. Ever since then they started referring us to studies and web pages and that are just useless. So I'll show you another example from the CDC. This one is March 1st of 2021, and again this was by my colleague Michael. So he had some back and forth with the CDC, and they were trying to refer him to these studies and web pages that aren't helpful. And he was responding back saying, you know, just trying to be super clear what he's asking for. And then on the bottom of page 3, you can see that I'll make it a little bit bigger. So they're saying the SME, which SME stands for subject matter expert. So they're saying the subject matter expert says the following. The definition of isolation provided in the request is outside what is possible in virology, as viruses need cells to replicate and cells require liquid food. So again, this is irrelevant because we didn't ask for records of a virus replicating without host cells. And the part about food is irrelevant too. We didn't ask for viruses being fed without food. I don't know how that's relevant. They said SARS-CoV-2 may be isolated from clinical specimens by culturing in cell culture, which is the bogus approach that doesn't actually end up purifying anything. And they say that's the definition of isolation used in microbiology. Yeah, so basically the key part that is really interesting in here is they're saying what you asked for is outside of what is possible in virology. So they admitted right there that what we're looking for, it just never gets done in virology at all. So it's not just a COVID-19 problem, it's an every virus problem. And we had that confirmed by other institutions as well. So I could show you, I thought I had it open, but maybe I don't. I'll show you
I see.
I'll show you another one.
The word
Sorry?
purification. Yeah, I see that you use the word purification. So you don't use
Yeah,
isolate.
In the beginning, I used the word isolation, but I stopped after a few months because, you know, we get all this controversy. I'll put my screen back. We get all this controversy over the word, and I don't want to get bogged down in arguments over the word isolation, because we have a lot of people who will gaslight us, and they'll say, well, some people even call these FOIs, which I say FOI stands for Freedom of Information. Some people actually call them a hoax, and they say that I'm trying to deceive people, that it's some kind of trick to fool people. And that's not what it is. We're just asking very clearly for what we want. But they say, oh, you're asking for the impossible, you're asking for isolation of a virus, but you're ruling out how viruses are isolated. Now, that's not what so they focus on the word isolation, and that's not the important part. The important part is we're looking for records where someone found this particle in the bodily fluids or tissue of a sick person and separated everything else out. That's what matters, right? So I started just using the word purification, just to avoid all these silly arguments. Yeah. Yes. So I could show you another one.
Yes.
I could. Okay, so I'll share my screen again, and I'll bring up one from Canada. These are all my Canadian ones are at the. So this page here, what I did here was there was a group of researchers from Canada, and they were from 4 different institutions, and they claimed in 2020 to have isolated the imaginary virus. So they were from University of Toronto, McMaster University, Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, and Mount Sinai Hospital. So researchers from those institutions claim to have jointly isolated the virus. So I sent FOIs to all 4 of those institutions, and I got responses back that none of them had any actual records. And the part that I want to show you that I think is most interesting is what we were told by Mount Sinai Hospital, which is a little further down. So here's Mount Sinai. And I'll just make it a little bit bigger so people can see. So the lady told me, I've been engaging with our experts at Sinai Health, and we're not clear on the records that you're requesting, as we're not aware that isolation of a virus in the manner you described is possible for any virus. It's not within the scope of current scientific processes. And then there was a follow-up letter a little while later, and she basically told me the same thing again. She reiterated that what you're asking for is it's never done in virology. So that just helps people to see that it's, these are the institutions that claim to have isolated a virus, and they're telling us, no, this is never actually done. They never actually purify them. And we also had a similar response from the Public Health Agency of Canada also. This is sorry, this one's quite long, but I think it's on the last couple of pages here. I'll show you what they said. They said that my request resulted in no records because the way I asked the question, the isolation of the virus is not completed without the use of another medium. Now, this is a red herring argument, because when I did the request, as I pointed out, I only asked for records where they didn't add any genetic material, because I don't want them contaminating the sample with, with a cell line or the fetal bovine serum. So, but we know that to do ultracentrifugation, they have to add the sucrose fluid or something to it. So I'm not saying you can't add anything at all. We're just saying don't give me records where they added genetic material. So when she says the isolation of the virus is not completed without the use of another medium, that's irrelevant, because I didn't exclude that. And then they go, the gold standard assay used to determine the presence of intact virus in patient samples is viral isolation in cell culture. So again, they're telling us the cell culture is the gold standard. With this assay, if virus is present in the patient sample, it will multiply and produce visible cytopathic effects, which means the infected cells demonstrate visible changes. So this is just their circular reasoning again, where they say, if there's a virus, you'll see cytopathic effects. Oh, there's cytopathic effects. It must have been caused by a virus, but that's illogical. It's a logical fallacy. And then they say, additionally, the detection of an increase in the genetic material by PCR further confirms that intact virus is present in the sample. And this is just ridiculous, because we all know that when they do these PCR tests, which isn't really even a proper test, but when they do them, they're only targeting a genetic sequence. And it's not even the entire genome, it's just a tiny piece of what they say the genome is. And it has nothing at all to do with the protein shell that supposedly surrounds the genome. And so even if a virus had been shown to exist, which to my knowledge has never ever happened ever in history, you could not confirm it with a PCR test, because for all you know, maybe the sequence came from something else, or maybe it came from a broken down virus, that had already been destroyed. So it cannot tell you that it's from an intact virus. And yet here they are specifically saying PCR further confirms the intact virus is present in the sample. This is so shocking, and it should be shocking to anybody who knows anything about PCR, because this is showing in black and white just blatant either incompetence or dishonesty. So yeah, and then they say later, another kind of funny statement, viral cells were used because they're essential to support viral replication and cell growth. Well, again, how does that make any sense? Because you're talking about a virus that supposedly infects people, and viral cells are the monkey kidney cells. So it doesn't make any sense. Why would you have to have monkey kidney cells to grow a virus that supposedly infects humans. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But these are the kind of responses we get. But at least they admitted that they have no records. They didn't try to put me off with the study. And I could show you one more if that's okay. So what the Health Canada told me, there's a couple of interesting statements in here. Again, just demonstrating the horrific incompetence of these institutions. So they said, Health Canada is responsible for authorization of health products. This type of information, meaning what I asked for, this type of information would not typically be evaluated by Health Canada as part of the authorization of their activities. And they say Health Canada does not work directly with patient samples or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now that part I could kind of understand because there's the Public Health Agency of Canada as well, but we have asked them and they don't have records either. So, but then another really shocking part is down on page 10. They said, please note, Health Canada's role is not to do pure scientific research and discovery. It is to review evidence provided by sponsors in order to make regulatory decisions to approve products and authorize clinical trials. You may wish to contact the sponsors of clinical trials and/or companies in order to get the information. So this is Health Canada. This is it's kind of like the FDA is in the United States. They approve, Health Canada approves the COVID-19 products and clinical trials. And yet here they are saying, oh, no, if you want that kind of information, ask the sponsors. They're literally telling us basically go to the pharmaceutical industry and ask them. Meanwhile, we have a whole country of people thinking that Health Canada is, competent and responsible. And for sure they know there's a virus, but they don't have the information, and neither does the Public Health Agency of Canada, neither does the National Research Council. And in Canada, we have asked 52 different institutions. These are federal and provincial and municipal institutions, and it includes universities. It also includes an institution called Vito Intervac, which is the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization - International Vaccine Center. This is an organization at the University of Saskatchewan, and they work with the international community. And they had also claimed to have isolated the virus. And yet when we asked them, they didn't have records either of proper purification. So this is where, they confuse a lot of people. They use the word isolation, and most people think it means that they purified, that they actually did proper science. And, but yeah, when you look into virology and you actually read the methods, it's never anything legitimate that they've been doing. So.
Thank you so much, Christine. I find this really incredible and shocking, especially the last letter that you showed, that they said that they are only reviewing the things that their sponsors give to them. So people really think, oh, these institutions are so scientific and they have this different information, and they just choose from different sources, and they just choose the best one, the most accurate one. But it's actually they only are looking at things that the pharmaceutical companies are giving them to look at. So they even refer to you to ask them. Was funny.
Yes.
I need to write a post about this one because it is very telling. Yes, so,
it's crazy, right? Sorry, I just thought too, maybe I should just quickly show you the World Health Organization as well, because I think most people, they will think, well, if anyone has these records, it's the World Health Organization, right? But I had written to them quite a while ago, and they didn't respond to me. But then a colleague in Japan wrote to them. This is the email that she sent to me, and telling me that she had written to them. And this is the response that she got. And well, I'll just show you quickly too what she asked them. So she gave them basically the same wording that I give them. She was very clear. Any records of purification of the alleged virus, make this bigger so that people can see it. She asked the same question, purification of the alleged virus, and she's not talking about culturing or PCR, etc. And their response was, on review of your message, please find the latest information regarding COVID-19, and they sent her to a web page. And I can't click on that because I had to redact out her name, and so I had to take a screenshot, and that's why I can't click on that. But in the original email, which I have a copy of, when you click on that page, it takes you to a web page that it doesn't have anything useful at all. It's just more smoke and mirrors to make it look like they're sending you to something useful, but it's actually just nonsense.
Thank you so much. So let's summarize a little bit for people. So what is happening is that, as Christine showed right now, she got these very important responses where they said that it is not possible, it is out of a possibility in virology to purify a virus as she requested to, and how it should happen if a virus really exists. So how it should happen. If you claim if there is a sick person and this person is sick because of a virus, you just take the fluids of this person and you just purify the virus out of it. So what you do, you basically find the virus there. And then you take this virus and you do all kinds of experiments you want. And the most important thing is obviously the first one, I would say, after you purify it, is just to show that it is really a virus, because if you don't show it, then it's not a virus, it's just something else. It is not something that really corresponds to this definition, because it doesn't make people sick or animals sick, so you need to show this. So yeah, the first step, you just take the sample of a sick person and you purify the virus out of it without using cells or things like this. It's just, they should not participate in this in any way. But they don't do it this way. They, instead of this, they just take cell culture, and then they put a sample of a person. They can purify the sample somehow to get a supernatant, or even not, it does not matter, but they put it in the cell culture, and then they add a lot of toxins, and they reduce the nutrition for these cells, and they just claim that it was not because of these things that they have done to their cells, but because of some virus that they have never seen and never purified, and have no idea if it actually is present there. And they do it because this is I think why also, like, these methods that I just talked about, the cell culture, it was invented in 1954 by American bacteriologist John Franklin Anders, and I think it got so popular and important for virologists back then, because he really provided some methods to make some impression that there is really something in the cell culture that can be pathogenic. So it's just an impression, because back then, from what I learned myself and I studied, back then they didn't really have anything. They didn't have any method to show some sort of effect at all. And now they have this cell culture, and they show this that this cell culture died. And because they want so much to make an impression of a virus existing, they just adopted it blindly. Yeah, so now we have it. And so when you ask them if you have some publications where they show that virus was actually found, like some structure, like some entity, they say it is not possible in virology. It's out of a possibility in virology. If we translate this to a normal language, it's not possible to find the virus. The only thing we can do is to try to create with very big difficulty, because like people who are, you know, like some kids, if they would look at what they are doing, they, I think, because, you know, kids, what I noticed that they have such a pure mind, they are not brainwashed yet, and they don't have this idea of authorities and being always right about things. So they would doubt, like, this is what I noticed with kids when I tried to explain them, that they would doubt that this really shows anything at all. because they see all the other methods that they use in their cell cultures with nutrition and toxins, and they would say, like, how do you know it's a virus if you use all these things? So, but anyway, they just say that the only thing we can do is just to try somehow to create this impression of a virus. This is the only thing that is possible in virology. Yeah, so
Exactly.
This is yes, very important answers to get.
Yeah, and you know what? I was just thinking I could just really quickly show you one more, if that's okay, because I did ask just, for the people who they don't understand our logic and they think it's fine to use a cell culture. I did ask one time the CDC if they have any records of the virus even being purified from a cell culture. And they couldn't even, they didn't even have anything for that. I'll just take you to the actual response letter. And this is what they told me. I won't read it, but they just gave me paragraphs that they always give us when we ask about purification from patient samples. They send us to these useless web pages and studies that are not helpful. So yeah, even after they do the cell culture, they say that the cell culture, the whole purpose is to give the virus a chance to grow, but then they still don't bother to purify out a particle, and even if they did, well, okay, you wouldn't know, did it come from the patient, or was it from the monkey cells, or was it from the toxic drugs, that caused the cells to break down? Like, you wouldn't know, or was it in the fetal bovine serum? But it doesn't matter because they don't even bother trying at that point either. So it's just any way you look at what they're doing, nothing makes any sense at all.
Yeah. Yeah, what is also extremely important that they never try to show it's pathogenic. They just claim it, but there are no actual studies. Like, even if they purified something, they would not proceed to show, like, if it caused diseases or anything at all.
And like, another thing too is, I mean, they've never even shown that there's a contagious disease that that they need to find the cause of. They didn't, like, for example, in Wuhan, they didn't discover some new disease that they needed to find the cause of, and they didn't show that there was any contagion happening. So when you look at it from that angle as well, and I haven't focused on the contagion part as much, I always looked at it like, okay, find the particle, show that it causes disease, show that it replicates, show that the disease, and then show the disease is contagious. But you could start at the other end too and say, well, did anyone even show that, people or animals are making each other sick just by being around each other? Because that's their whole story. And yet, from what I understand, there's been many attempts over the years where they tried to show animals or people, I don't know if they've done it with animals, but people making each other sick, and they weren't able to do it at all. So I have filed one request to the CDC on that topic recently, but I didn't get the response yet. So when I get it, I'm quite confident that they're not going to have any records, but I'll make that public as well once we get that response back.
So you mean that you ask them if they have any studies of that can prove contagion in a natural way, like?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Do they have any evidence of contagion
without using like strange injections with toxins in the head or in heart, just with no contact activities?
Yeah. That one, I just asked it in a very simple way. I think I just said, do you have any scientific evidence of contagion? So it'll be interesting to see what they respond back. But if contagion was really a thing, I'm sure like, they've tried studies in the past where they had sick people, Spanish flu or what have you, spending time around healthy people, or they even took fluids from the sick people and put them in the healthy people, and they just couldn't make anybody sick. So yeah, everything that they tell us seems to be based on nothing.
They just want to create fear. This is the main goal that they have, not science. Yeah. So Yes, you already said that you got these responses that where they admit that it is not possible to find any virus in virology. But anyway, I want to ask you, so which were other viruses that you asked about? For example, measles, HIV, other viruses.
Right. So I'll share my screen again, and I'll take you to another page. I'll just show people too, if they want to see these are all on my website. All these documents are publicly available. So if you go to this website, it's fluoride free peel, and it's .ca because I'm in Canada. So fluoridefreepeel.ca, and then you click on the COVID-19. That's where it will take you to this main page. But these are all the SARS-CoV-2 purification FOIs. And then we have, I'll close these tabs now, and then I'll show you, we have another page, and this page is dedicated to all the other alleged viruses. So we've asked, myself and colleagues, we've asked about many alleged viruses, not every single one because there's lots of them, but we've asked about a lot of them, and most of the most famous ones. And again, it doesn't matter what institution we ask or what alleged virus we're asking them about, they still never have any evidence of it even being found and purified. And this first response here is quite important because this is the Public Health Agency of Canada again, and this is the institution that supposedly knows all about viruses and whatnot. So they should have it if it existed. And here I asked them for any record of any alleged virus that supposedly infects humans. So it wasn't even a specific, could be influenza, measles, anything at all, HIV, HPV. And they just admitted flat out. I was actually quite shocked. I'll enlarge it a bit. Oops, maybe that's a bit too much. So down here it says your record has resulted in a no records request. And then they just gave me the same blurb that they gave me before about how you have to, you have to use a cell culture supposedly. So that was one of the most shocking ones. And then with some institutions, we've asked about any virus that is covered by their so-called vaccination schedule. So again, this covers a lot of different alleged viruses. And the CDC was asked about that, and they have nothing. They have no record whatsoever. And then we've asked, there's a few institutions. So this is also true for Australia's Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, and that is Australia's National Science Research Agency. So if anybody in Australia had records of this, they should have it. And yet they said, despite an extensive search, CISRO, which is the short form for this organization, they have been unable to identify any document relevant to our request. So they had nothing. So nothing for any alleged virus that supposedly is, covered by a vaccination schedule. Same thing with New Zealand's Ministry of Health. They didn't have anything. New Zealand Ministry of Health, they were asked again and they still had nothing. And they actually told my colleague, you have been advised that should you make further requests for the same information, the ministry may refuse your request as they may consider it frivolous or vexatious. So they're actually, kind of threatening not to even communicate with him anymore. Then we have the New Zealand Crown Research Institute, which is the Institute of Environmental Science and Research. So again, if anybody in New Zealand had this information, they should be the ones, and yet they didn't have anything, and I haven't read this one recently, but they're talking about cell cultures again. And they were asked another time, I think, and they didn't have it. And then some people in Denmark did the same thing with, there's an institution there, I have no idea how you pronounce that, but also Statin Serum Institute. They asked two institutions and they're both in this one PDF. And again, nothing. And then we have a lady in England, and she has asked many different local municipal governments. So these are the towns, the cities, because they have public health units and they participated in scaring people, telling people there's a virus, come and get tested, administering the injections, that sort of thing. So they should also have this information because they have medical officers and they claim to be experts. So they should have this information too. And this colleague has contacted many of them, and they never have any record. And when she contacts them, she typically will ask them about 10 different viruses. So measles, HIV, HPV, influenza, Ebola, Zika. She asks them about a whole bunch, and they don't have anything for any of these viruses. And then people can just scroll down the page. There was adenovirus. Most of these where we have entries, I have asked the CDC because they're so influential around the world. A lot of people just think that the CDC must know what they're talking about. So that's usually who I ask when it comes to other viruses, but other people, they've asked other institutions as well. And it just doesn't matter. This is the European CDC, their version, and that was for the H5N1 avian influenza virus. They didn't have anything. And it just goes on and on and on. There's Ebola virus. Nobody had that. Epstein-Barr, hepatitis. We only have one for that. Herpes, HIV. It goes on and on and on. So yeah, hopefully this helps people to realize that there's just nothing. Doesn't matter which one we ask about. So again, these are all publicly. There's one from Japan, National Institute of Infectious Diseases. That was for influenza virus. They have nothing. So yeah, hopefully this helps people to see what's really going on there in virology. It's not what we were led to believe all our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really find that, your website is just like a treasury. It's an incredible work that you have done. Yeah. I think everyone should go there and really read everything because it's just very, very fabulous. I find it like I want to thank you for doing it because
thank you. Well,
yes,
and like I said, I had a lot of help. I can't take all the credit. I did a lot, especially in Canada and with the CDC, but there's been people all around the world helping with this. So they all, they get credit too. And especially a colleague, Michael S. in New Zealand, he's done a lot of the work, and that lady in England, but lots and lots of people helped. So I just decided, it's really helpful to have everything gathered in one place, because if people see one response here and another there, you tend to forget, right? But if it's all together in one spot. And another thing that's on my website, I don't know if you ever did an interview with Torsten Engelbrecht in Germany. He's an investigative, he's one of the co-authors on Virus Mania book. Yeah, so he also, in 2020, he wrote to different virologists who had claimed to have isolated SARS-CoV-2. So they were not freedom of information. They were just more like casual emails directly to the study authors. And he was asking them, did you guys actually purify? And if so, questions relating to that. And none of them had purified. So those are on my website as well, just to help people know about Torsten's work also. Yeah, and then I have another page I could show you if that's okay.
Yes. Also, when you open your website, you can also show, if you asked what I'm interested, anything about control experiments.
Yeah, that's what I was going to show you. So I'll take you back and we'll go to that page. So we have another page here devoted to control experiments. And we have quite a lot here, and all these responses are just quite ridiculous. And I'll just make a comment before we get started. So the way I look at it, I mean, on the one hand, we know that they never purify out particles that they think might be a virus. Nobody does this. So on the one hand, in a way, you kind of don't even have to ask questions about the control experiments, because if they don't have a pure sample, you can't do a fully controlled experiment. So we know that. So what I say at the top here is the quick answer is no, they don't have any fully controlled experiments because they didn't purify. But there's also, that's what you would have to do if you wanted to actually prove that there's a specific particle and that actually causes disease and, you know, causes a contagious disease, etc. So they don't do that. But the other thing that they can do, and this relates to what Dr. Stefan Lanka has done and what Marvin Haberlin did recently in Germany, is ask them, okay, you know, did you even do controls that are not 100% fully controlled experiments, but did you even do experiments where you did a kind of half-baked control where you, let's say if you're taking a sample from a sick person and you're going to do a cell culture or an animal experiment, did you at least do a control where you took a sample also from a healthy person, or, you know, something else related, like, well, for example, in the cell culture experiments, Dr. Lanka did different versions of control experiments. So what I'm trying to get at is, on this page, we're asking them questions about those kind of experiments that might have been done, and in some cases have been done, where it's not a fully controlled experiment, but it's at least some kind of attempt to have some kind of control happening. So that's what we're asking about on these pages. So just to try to be a little more clear, with some of these studies, when we look at them with, say, for example, with the cell culture, most of the studies, they don't mention controls at all. Like there's just nothing. They don't seem to have any kind of control. So they didn't have a control group where they did any kind of cell culture with any kind of control. Or when they're doing their so-called sequencing, no control. But there are some studies where they mention mock controls. Usually that's what they call it. And for example, the CDC study by Jennifer Harcourt and her colleagues, they make mention of some mock controls. And this is in a few other studies as well. And the interesting thing when they do this, all the studies I have seen, when they mention mock controls, they don't even mention this in the methods section. And that's where they should be giving like really clear details, like this is exactly what we did in our study. Because the whole point is when you're reporting your study, you should report all the important details in your methods so that somebody else could try to replicate your study and see if they get the same results. But they don't even mention these so-called mock controls in the methods section. So it's very sketchy. And then they'll just mention it in the results somewhere in passing. They make a vague reference to some mock controls. And, you know, often they'll show an electron microscopy image and they'll say, oh, these are controls and we didn't get the cytopathic effect. But they don't give you all the, like, we don't know exactly what did you do with these so-called mock controls. So what I'm talking about is they did a cell culture. So we know, okay, presumably they used the same cells, the monkey cells, but what exactly did you do to them? Did you give them the same amount of drugs? Did you lower the fetal bovine serum? Did you do everything the same? And then did you add any clinical sample at all? Because, you know, you could do a control where you add a clinical sample from a healthy person. And maybe what you'll find is you still get cytopathic effects even when you add something from a healthy person. So this is what we're asking them about in some of these requests. We're trying to get more details, like, okay, your study mentions mock controls, but we don't know exactly what you did. So can you tell us? We want the documents that show exactly what you did. So hopefully I made that a little more clear. And basically we never get, we haven't had, with the freedom of information attempts, we haven't had any success. So there's always some excuse why they don't want to give us the information. And it's actually quite ridiculous what they tell us. So, for example, my colleague, he asked the CDC about this. He asked about the CDC study, and they just give him a nonsense response. It had a lot of pages. There were 37 pages that they gave him, but it was just some emails between virologists, and it didn't have the information that we looked for. And I think they included a study as well. And again, it didn't have the information that we wanted. And then I did a request. I tried again with the CDC with slightly different wording, and I was asking them for the same thing. They sent me 24 pages of what you can see here, just the letters A, T, C, and G. And it's just a printout of the so-called genome, their made up, computer genome. That doesn't tell me anything about their mock controls, right? Like, this is just silly, but these are the kind of things that they send us. And sometimes they give excuses too. Like my colleague Michael in New Zealand, he asked the UK Health and Security Agency. He wanted details from them about how they do their so-called controls. And they actually refused, and their excuse was they cited a national security exemption. They actually said, I'm not sure where it is exactly in there, but they cited a national security exemption saying that if they gave out this information, it would be a danger to the public, because then, somebody else could go and try to do these experiments. And, this is completely silly, because when they publish these studies, they give the details they usually give pretty clear details of what they did in the experimental group. So they tell you which drugs they added. They tell you how much fetal bovine serum. They tell you that they lowered the fetal bovine serum. So they're already giving this information out for the experimental group. All we're trying to say is, what exactly did you did to your so-called mock control group? Because we want to know, like, how similar was it? And then they say, well, that's a national security risk. They can't tell us. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's just ridiculous. And then we've had, in one situation, Michael, I think it was a New Zealand institution, they told, this is it here. This was the New Zealand's Crown Research Institution. They wanted him to pay almost $3,000 to get the details, which, and we weren't going to shell out $3,000. So they said, this is quite funny, actually. They said that in order for them to find the details of their, so-called control experiment, it would take a senior researcher 40 hours to search for the details. This is information that should be on hand. It should, if you're going something this important, it should be well documented. In some countries like Germany, they even have laws saying you have to document. It makes no sense. Like, you shouldn't have to spend 40 hours to go back and search for the details, but that's what they told him. So, and then we also have, there's a few other people who have also, they've written to authors, directly to study authors, and just sent a casual email, and they're asking authors who were involved in different studies, trying to get more details from them. So we have some colleagues who have focused more on the sequencing, the fake sequencing that they do. And he's asking questions like, when you do your so-called sequencing procedure, do you do all those same steps again, but without the alleged virus? So do you use a clinical sample from a healthy person or some other type of control? And they get all sorts of strange responses. Like, basically they usually admit that they didn't bother doing it. Sometimes they say they were in too much of a rush, or they wanted to focus all their resources on the supposedly infected samples. They didn't want to bother doing controls. There was a response from one scientist, so-called scientist, and they basically admitted that they should do controls, and that what they have published is not really very good. Like it's not proper. They haven't done proper controls yet, and that this is a weakness. Um, so yeah, they even admitted in that case that there's a problem there. In this response from somebody in France, they confessed to my colleague that later, after what they had done, whatever they published, later they did try doing some control experiment, and they got what they called weak positive results, which they're indicating, yeah, we got the fake genome even when we did it with a control experiment, but they didn't publish that, and it didn't sound like they have any attention to. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff on this page. There's a lot of variation, and most of it was not done by me. Most of this was done by other people. But there's a lot for people to dive into. Like you said, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. And what we're doing, we're just trying to help people see just how unscientific and illogical virology really is. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Yes, I would consider this website to be one of the most important in the world. This is
Yeah.
I'm very excited. Yes, that we have
and I just want people to understand too, like I don't have a background in biology or chemistry or anything. Like literally virology is so silly, it's so ridiculous, anybody can understand. And it's just, for the most part, it's just lay people who we don't have these backgrounds, but we can see how ridiculous it is, and we're just just doing simple things that anybody can do to help document. So yeah, all the credit goes to people like Dr. Lonka and the Perth Group and Dr. Cowan and Kaufman and the Baileys and all these other people that they have a lot of background knowledge and started pointing out these problems very early on. So I just learned from other people, and I could see that it was true, and that's it. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I wanted to read something to you because I found it very funny, because once I wrote a post and I wrote it about freedom on information requests. So I wrote it in Russian and immediately got fact-checked, like immediately.
Oh.
And it was on Instagram and they got it blurred so everyone can see that it is fact-checked. And I want to read you what they wrote, because it is very silly, but people who, are very new to this, they took it very seriously, but I already explained them, like, why is it silly, but I will read it now because I think you will find it funny. So they wrote, the existence of the new coronavirus is a scientific fact, and therefore for CDC, there was no need to prove it. Similarly, the Ministry of Agriculture would rather not provide the details to a request that asked for proof of the existence of cows, since the ministry most likely never created any records of proving the existence of cows.
Yeah, so, and I've heard people say things like that too. So yeah, this is so silly because, an alleged virus is something that's not visible to our eyes. We can see each other, we can see cows, we can watch cows, we can observe what they do. I've had people say to me, has the sun been purified, etc. I mean, there are things that we can observe with our eyes and watch what it does. But an alleged virus is something invisible. Nobody sees them flying through the air and infecting people and making people sick. So obviously you would need to use this technology and special equipment to verify these assumptions. And then also with anything, if you want to attribute causation to something, you usually need to do a controlled experiment. Now there's exceptions, like for example, if I watch someone push somebody down a staircase, I don't need to do a controlled experiment to figure out what happened, because I saw what happened. I know what the cause was. But when it comes to people getting sick, and you want to know what the cause is, and you think it's this tiny little particle, well, again, it's not a process we can watch with our naked eye and see it happen in real time. There are lots of situations where the only way to know for sure would be to do the controlled experiment and see what happens. So it's just a silly sort of comparison for people to make. Yeah, and we've had other strange like gaslighting attempts when it comes to the FOIs. Like we've had some people either they didn't even bother to read any of the requests or they're purposely misleading people, but sometimes people will make it sound like I asked these institutions to actually give me a sample of the virus. And, of course, that's not what I did, right? Freedom of information is just for asking for records, and that's what we did. Like we know how freedom of information works. But yeah, we get a lot of gaslighting, or they make it sound like we're asking for something impossible. But again, supposedly other particles that are just as small or even smaller get purified. And again, in my wording of my requests, I'm even saying, as per the standard laboratory practices. So we're not asking for anything, unreasonable or ridiculous. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that I had is this one. On your way of doing this work and activism of spreading the information and educating people about virology, what did you have to deal with in terms of resistance from, let's say, the system towards your work? I mean, things like censorship or fact checks or something else.
Yeah, we definitely, I think it's funny. Like well, okay, I used to be on Twitter, early on in fake COVID. I was on Twitter, and of course I was sharing the responses. I did get kicked off Twitter in the summer of 2021, and they didn't give me an exact reason for why they kicked me off, but everything I was doing there was about exposing virology. So we did have that happen. Lots of people get strikes on Facebook or social media. You get suspended for a while, sometimes for a few days or weeks. So we get a lot of that. In Canada, actually, just I think in the last 2 days, there was a new bill passed, and their government is saying that they're going to be influencing internet search results so that misinformation comes much further down in the results and it will be much harder to find. And that sort of thing, I'm sure it already happens, for example, on Facebook too. They do what people call shadow banning, or they just make it harder for people to find your certain posts. Yeah, and then we had, like, for example, in Canada, there was a gentleman who went to court and he was trying to get this issue dealt with in court. So I forget exactly what it was called, but some kind of, I think it was a request for an administrative review or something. I don't know much about the legal system, but basically was asking the judge to look at this and realize that there's not even proof of the virus. And so he asked me for an affidavit and I gave it to him. So that got filed. And this gentleman, he made his arguments that the virus hadn't even been shown to exist. And what the judge did, this was a federal judge, and he used a mechanism. It's called judicial notice. So I don't know if it's in every country, but it's something where, there's a court case going on and there's some issues that are just too trivial. You don't need to look at evidence. So it should be for very basic things like the sky is blue, grass is green. There's certain things we don't need to spend time, waste the court's resources in looking at evidence. And this judge, he actually took judicial notice of the existence of the virus. And so my friend's attempt was not successful because there was no review of evidence whatsoever. The judge just basically dismissed the issue, saying, no, basically everybody knows there's a virus, everybody, scientists around the world, the whole world knows it exists. This is not something worth looking at. So that's another that's another thing that happens there. And also, I would say a lot of the leaders in the so-called health freedom movement, there's a lot of, quite famous people who have large platforms, and that they don't want to address this issue either. So,
and now, Christine.
Mary, first of all, the no virus people are not, we don't have a hypothesis. We're refuting a hypothesis. So obviously my question for you is related to what Bill was just saying. I want to know, what is Children's Health Defense's current position on the issue? Does the virus exist or does it not? And the reason I have to ask this is because in April of last year, Eric Coppolino questioned Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at an event. It was recorded. It's on Eric's website. He asked Robert to comment on the hundreds of Freedom of Information responses that my colleagues and I have collected from around the world, showing that no one has a sample of the alleged virus. No one has any record of anyone on Earth obtaining a sample of the alleged virus. And of course, if you don't have a sample of the alleged virus, you can't have any science whatsoever, and you can't have a validated test. You can't have any COVID-19 science whatsoever. And Robert's response, basically, he became very tongue-tied, tried to laugh it off, and in the end said he wished he had just shut up from the beginning and said that he was not going to answer the question. And then later in 2020, there was a private email from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to a prominent person in the no virus movement who had been asking Robert to help us, because we've been busting our asses since early 2020 to get this truth out with no help whatsoever from Children's Health Defense. And like Bill was saying, you guys are just underlining, rubber stamping the core lie, the core fraud. And Robert's response was, I'm grateful for your courage and intellectual integrity. I have an open mind on this issue. I admire and I encourage you, but I must beg off on this war for the time being. I'm more likely to join you if you get it near the goal line where the cost returns ratio improves. And then in late last year, I contacted you and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I asked you, what science are you relying on? Your website is full of content about a virus, a pandemic, all sorts of things relating to the alleged virus. I asked you what science you're relying on. You gave me no answers whatsoever. And then you put me in touch with Jay Cooey, who you and Jay both told me that Jay was CHD's science consultant. Jay Cooey also was not able to cite a shred of science. And then on one of his videos about 2 months ago, he admitted that for the last 20 years, virology has been based on indirect observations of things that virologists cannot even prove exist. This is your science consultant saying this. So my question, what is CHD's current position on the alleged virus? Does it exist, yes or no? And if yes, then what science are you relying on?
I don't know that I can answer that in a way that you will find satisfying. I think we're open to the idea that there's not a virus. We're open to the idea that there is a virus. We write about both dimensions to that. Jay Cooey is somebody who has studied virology, and so I think he is and has been delving more deeply in that. We're trying to cover the issue. I don't think we've stated that there is a virus. We haven't stated that there's not a virus. We're exploring what the reality is, and we clearly agree with you that there are very serious problems with the narrative. I don't think we have definitive answers on a lot of this. Bobby's writing a book.
With all due respect, your website is full of content about a virus, gain of function. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a whole book coming out about the origin of so-called COVID. You have not been dealing with this in a balanced way. You had David Rasnick and Michael Wallach on one time, and I think there's one presentation with Alex Zek or one other something on your website, compared to what, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of articles, interviews, conversations about COVID-19 as if it's a real phenomenon. So no, with all due respect, you have not been helping at all. You've been extremely one-sided, which to me is just blatantly unethical, unlawful. You're misleading your people rely on you guys for accurate information, and they think, for God's sake, if there was no virus, of all people, Children's Health Defense would be warning us. It's what it's been like for the last 3 years. It's been like having another layer of government to have to deal with, to dispel all the nonsense coming out of your organization, because there's millions of people there. So it's not even just the governments or the mainstream media. It's also people who are exposing a certain amount of the problems with the COVID narrative, but they won't address this issue. So they just basically keep talking about viruses and gain of function and lab leak and all this kind of thing, as though viruses exist. And they, for the most part, they just completely ignore this issue. So yeah, just say, even though we have all this opposition, still lots of people are catching on to the truth. At least in the health freedom movement, there's been a huge shift. I mean, we've seen it here in North America, and hopefully you have seen it where you are too, because you're doing great work, and different people around the world making efforts to expose this. So there has been a lot of change in the last couple of years that I have observed. And yet, of course, we have a long way to go when it comes to reaching the wider public.
Yes, I agree. So another question that I often get, and I answered myself many times, but because, this is something that people who just discover the virology hoax, they are always confused about this thing. So I want to hear what you would say, your perspective on it. Why, if it is so incredibly evident, even to a small child, as I said, if you explain this to them, for them it will be evident that virology is purely anti-scientific, and like there is nothing to talk about even in virology. So how did it happen so that it got such a growth and incredible development and influence as it has now? And how come virologists are so incredibly blind that they can't manage to see that what they are doing does not make any sense at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess I can only speculate, but like you were mentioning before, the cell culture part got started back in the 1950s with the John Enders paper. And one thing that I understand happened was that a few years later, John Enders was given a Nobel Prize. And usually, once people get a Nobel Prize, people tend to just assume that they're a genius, and probably far less inclined to bother checking their work and seeing if it was valid. So I would imagine that helped a lot for this virology nonsense to continue. But of course, virology started long before that too. And it seems to me that there has always been a motivation to control people and fear is always a great motivator and a great way to help to control people. And we see it being used in other contexts as well. So I strongly believe, it's not something I can prove, but there's a lot of evidence pointing to that it's being used as a tool by governments and globalists to control populations and to get people to go along with all sorts of changes that otherwise we would not have agreed to. All the changes that they made in our lives in the last few years. And also, I don't want to sound, I think there are people in the world that it's easier to control people when they're sick or dead. You don't have to worry about, when you keep people sick or you're actually killing them, they have less ability to look at what you are doing. These corrupt governments and the organizations that control them as well, and the bankers and the people, they've always been controlling people. They control people through the money system as well. They financially enslave people. So it's not hard to see that there's definitely people in this world who want other people kept down, and they don't want them noticing all of their crimes. So, terrifying people over an imaginary virus and getting them to submit to all kinds of changes, to surveil them, to monitor everything that they do, and to injure them and to kill some of them. It's unfortunately, I think that is part of what is going on, even though it doesn't mean that every single politician is in on it, or, of course not, right? A lot of them, they just get fooled too. But I think there are people in this world, and there have to be people, even in virology, that there have to be people that can see that what they're doing, it doesn't make sense. And I think there's different, factors probably for different people. Sometimes it's just a person, if you speak up at work and you point out to your boss that, hey, this doesn't really make sense what we're doing. They probably don't want to hear that from you, and you might lose your job, right? And I'm sure there have been people that have spoken up over the years and they lost their job and they didn't have a way of getting the word out to people. And then there's, I've heard Dr. Stefan Lanka say that when he first started realizing what was going on and that it didn't make sense, he doubted himself for a long time because, you see something that it's so entrenched, it's been going on for years and years, and you're looking at it and it doesn't make any sense. And so it's only natural that people would think, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm missing something, I think that's probably what some people do. And so he said it took him quite a while before he spoke out because he kept doubting himself. And then there's fear of, what people will think about you if you start saying these things. And we had a lot of that in 2020. I experienced a lot of it myself when talking on social media, trying to tell people. They just thought we're crazy. So most people don't want to be the one to put themselves out there and, have people calling them names and thinking that they're crazy. So I think there's a lot of different motivations and a lot of different factors for different people. And some people, they're just, we're so conditioned, I think, most people from childhood, when you go to school, especially, to just listen to the authorities, listen to your teacher, trust the expert, go to the doctor, and it happens in other areas, many areas of life. We're just supposed to follow the crowd and listen to the so-called experts. So I think that's a lot of it as well. People are just not thinking enough for themselves.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with everything that you said. So another question that I had is how people can financially support your work, financially support you. Do you receive any donations?
If people can, that's wonderful. I have on that FOI webpage, the first one I was showing you, if people scroll quite far down near the bottom, there's a PayPal button. I know PayPal is not popular because they've, damaged some of their clients, because they didn't like the things that they're saying. But unfortunately, I don't know a better method right now. And then I have a Substack as well. And oh yeah, I should tell people about my Substack, because Substack is it's basically a platform where people can publish newsletters, and the newsletters go out by email to anyone who signs up. And it also gives you a way, it's kind of like a website where you can go and find all my newsletters. So if people, and there's a donation button there too. And that's Christine Massey, FOIS.substack.com. Christine Massey, FOIS.substack.com. So that's another place where people can find the information and donate if they're able to. I appreciate it.
Yes, for sure. I encourage all the people to donate, because you have done such an incredible job and created that website that we now all can use. And this is the more we have people like you, and the more work you are able to do, the more free time you have to do it, and we all benefit from this. So I encourage everyone. And I think this is the last question that I have, which is very interesting. It is this one. What, in your opinion, we should do to bring this idea about viruses and contagion to an end in our society as fast as possible? Which actions and which strategy do you see as productive and powerful ones?
I think exactly what we've been doing. You know, you do your incredible videos and your interviews, and with people like Mike Stone and Mark Bailey writing incredible articles. And I guess the way I look at it is, I think everybody should use whatever comes naturally to them. And different approaches. Different people are more comfortable with different approaches. I prefer mostly to do things in writing. So. But I think basically what we're doing, I think it's working. And like what Marvin Haverland did the other day in Germany, where he went to court and was prepared to argue, and defend himself against a fine. He was prepared to argue that there's no evidence of the virus. So I've never been very good at strategy. When I was working on water fluoridation, I didn't really get very far. I think I educated some people in the community, but yeah, I think basically just keep doing all the different things that we're doing, and because we have the truth on our side, and the obstacle is just getting the information to people, and people having an open enough mind that they will look at it, and gradually more and more people are doing that. So.
Freedom of Information Act requests have been made to the Center for Disease Control asking for evidence that CDC has isolated or purified the SARS-CoV-2 virus. On June 7, 2021, the CDC informed again in writing they do not have any record showing that they have ever isolated or purified the virus that allegedly causes the disease called COVID-19. It says the written requests were made by Miss Christine Massey to CDC, ATSDR, FOIA Chief Officer Robert Ando to deliver any records, research, or any findings for any viral isolation and purification by anyone, anywhere, anytime in the world from a patient sample via maceration, filtration, and or the use of an ultracentrifuge, which is called the gold standard for isolating and identifying a pathological microorganism.
So I think if we continue on this path, who knows, maybe even in our lifetime we'll see a really significant, I hope we will. That's what I'm aiming for. Hopefully in our lifetimes, hopefully in the next few years.
Well, from what I see, I think that it will happen pretty soon, because the information is spreading like crazy. And I think the more pandemics and hoaxes like this they are doing, it is worse for them. The more they do it, it's worse for them. Because right now in Russia, they started with some measles hoax. It looks like that they want to try to implement something that people are dealing now in Germany with. So they want, but it looks like this to me. So they want eventually to pass some laws so that kids cannot go to school without this vaccine. But obviously, I'm not sure. I cannot be sure 100% that they will do it. But right now, they are just removing all the kids who are not vaccinated from the school, and they created this plan that they, until the end of this year, they just want to vaccinate everyone who is not vaccinated against measles. Yes, but people, they already, they remember what happened with COVID, a lot of people. So I don't think it will be easy for them at all. And yes, the more they do it, the more opportunities we have to bring attention to this topic, so it doesn't remain frozen like it was before, and just something is changing. Yeah, so
exactly.
Yes, maybe we will see some, who knows, maybe in 10 years it will just disappear, like virology. Who knows if we will keep working with this pace, or even faster, because more people will join. Then, yes,
I agree.
Yeah, so how people can find you besides the website that I will link and I will put on the screen, your website that you mentioned.
Well, okay, I'll bring up my Substack. Those are basically the two ways for people to find me. So I'll just show the Substack. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, so basically you would, there's my most recent article, and the day before I had shared something that you had written, that you had shared on Facebook. But yeah, basically these are newsletters. So here's one of the recent ones, and I just send out them whenever we get new responses. I upload them and I send them out in a newsletter. And then I also share all the latest articles and videos and stuff that other people have done. So it's a nice way too, if people go there, it will help them find other people like yourself, like Mike Stone and the Baileys and Dr. Lanka, etc. So yeah, I'll make it a little bit bigger so people can, oh no, it's not, I thought I was gonna make the URL bigger, but that doesn't work. So yeah, those are the two main ways. It's my website and the Substack. Yeah, and if someone needs to email me, they can find my email address pretty easily as well. So
I will write it down too in the description.
Okay, it's on my website, but I'll just give you, people can find it easily because in the FOIs I show my email address, so any of those documents they can find them, but it's CM as in Mary SSYC@gmail.com. So, but it's hard for me to answer lots and lots of emails, so only if it's something important. I ask people to email me only if it's important.
Okay, thank you. It was such a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad to talk to you finally. I have been following you for the whole time, like I think basically since you started. So I have a lot of admiration for you and thank you. You are one of my heroes.
Oh, okay, the feeling is mutual because you have done some amazing films and interviews too. So same to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm honored to have been invited on your platform. So
I'm honored to talk to you. So thank you, and I hope you have a good day. And yeah.
Thank you too,
Let's
Kate.
do it.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.